point, but I'm very excited to start Sefer Nehemiah. So, Rabbi Angel, if you could take us into Sefer Nehemiah.
Okay, thank you so much, Bernie and Stephen, and all of you again for coming. Good evening. Just one correction to Bernie. I'm sorry to correct my host. There is no such thing as Sefer Nehemiah, as we discussed back in week number one. It's Sefer Ezra Nehemiah. I'll prove it to you with the very first verse. The narrative of Nehemiah, son of Chachaliah, in the month of Kislev of the 20th year, when I was in the fortress of Shushan. The 20th year of what? Doesn't tell you, right? But isn't this chapter 1, verse 1? Shouldn't the introductory verse in a book tell you the 20th year of something, somebody? The answer is that because this isn't a new book, it is the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which we're going to hear explicitly in a little while, because we already had been introduced to that king when we learned Ezra last time. Ezra came in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, and then Nehemiah is going to come in the 20th year. 13 years after Ezra. So our year setting right now is 445. So yes, as I discussed in week one, I'll just paraphrase it again. It's not Bernie's fault. We all make this mistake, and I'm going to refer to Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, because out of sheer convention, since the time of the Septuagint, and then the Vulgate, and then the printing press, we have adopted the break between Ezra and Nehemiah to the point where in all of our printed editions, not just the one that I have or that Bernie has, anybody's, there's a separate section with the big giant font that says Nehemiah in it, both in Hebrew and in English, at least in mine. And so it signals that there is a new book here, but our tradition very emphatically reminds us it's one book. Ezra and Nehemiah, we are studying one literary unit together in this 4-part series. So Rashi just picks up on this point as well in verse 1, just saying that Nehemiah now is the presumed author of this section of the bigger book that we now call Ezra Nehemiah. Again, tradition just calls it Sefer Ezra. There is no Sefer. Nehemiah's name is not even in the name of the title. I'm just calling it Ezra Nehemiah out of convention because Nehemiah is mentioned in our printed texts. So anyway, in that 20th year of Artaxerxes, which computes to 445 BCE, 13 years after Ezra arrived, Hanani, one of my brothers, together with some men of Yehudah, arrived. And I asked them about the Jews, the remnant who had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. They replied, the survivors who have survived the captivity there in the province are in dire trouble and disgrace. The Hebrew word is cherpa. Okay, there's a disgrace. Jerusalem's wall is full of breaches, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Right, now let's get our little timeline here. Nebuchadnezzar is the king who breached these walls, and he breached these walls back in 586 BCE in the process of destroying the Beit HaMikdash and sacking Jerusalem. 586 BCE. We are now in 445 BCE, or approximately 141 years later. This isn't news. It's like, oh my gosh, the walls have breaches and it's embarrassing and shameful. No kidding. It's been like this for 141 years. Every Jew on the planet knows that, right? So it's an important question because it just signals to us that something much more recent that Jews in Israel would know about, and that even Nehemiah, a very prominent official, is the cupbearer of King Artaxerxes, as we're going to learn, he doesn't know about this. So fortunately for us, we happen to have it. I sent out the source sheets in the chat. I hope you have it. In source number 1, we skipped over it or talked about it very briefly in week 1. But back in Ezra chapters 1 to 6, there's chapter 4. Chapter 4, we read the beginning of it where the enemies of the Jews gave us a very hard time. Zerubbabel had objected to their participating in building the Beit HaMikdash. They persecuted us. They sent accusations to the king. And the whole chapter then becomes an amalgam. They accused us in the time of Cyrus, and again in Darius, and again in Achashverosh, and again in Artaxerxes. It actually fast forwards out of the time sequence of the book and gives you different accusations that they made at different times. The one of Artaxerxes, which is enumerated at length over there, you could read Ezra chapter 4 on your own. The Jews were building the walls of Jerusalem. And it must be, or at least it stands to reason, that was some event that occurred before what Nehemiah is talking about. And the enemies then accused us of rebellion. Oh no, the Jews are rebelling against the king. That's why they're building their walls. And Artaxerxes said, oh yeah, I don't think so. And he ordered the walls forcibly stopped. And so they were stopped. Artaxerxes believed the accusation. So presumably, in their glee, the enemies then took the opportunity to make further breaches in the wall and light some of it on fire, so that there was now a new layer of destruction far later, meaning very recently, far later than Nebuchadnezzar's original destruction. And so you have in source number 1 in the source sheet just the key verse. Artaxerxes was very lawyerly in a good way. He issued a decree that the walls must halt immediately. And so they were. But then he also argues, the source of 1 is the one verse that I wanted to pluck out from that longer paragraph. Now issue an order to stop these men. Those are the words of Artaxerxes in his letter. The city is not to be rebuilt until I so order. He does not make this an irreversible decree, but rather he says the walls are now halted until I say otherwise. This, presumably, the story that we are about to read, is that otherwise. Artaxerxes now feels bad about the situation and allows Nehemiah and other Jews to return to the land of Israel to rebuild the walls. So he's reversing his original decree only because we know this from Megillat Esther. Achashverosh on a couple of occasions just says, sorry, you can't reverse the decree. So come up with some other letter that doesn't reverse my decree. In Sefer Daniel, we find out that Daryavesh, the Median king, one of the founders of this empire that we're in now in our story, likewise could not reverse one of his own decrees. But in this case, Artaxerxes was smart and gave himself that opening. And that's what we're going to pick up on now. Going back to this word cherpa, it's amazing to hear that, I think of a wall around an ancient city as primarily protection. That's why you build a wall. You're building a wall so that it will be able to repel invaders or make it far more difficult to capture Jerusalem. But it's very clear from this verse and other verses in our Sefer that there's a lot more going on. And scholars pick it up very nicely. Contemporary scholars talk about it how psychologically it's a sign of national pride to have a walled city whose walls are fixed, they're intact. It's obviously very shameful to them. It degrades them and possibly also degrades Hashem in the eyes of the nations. Wow, the Jews are building a temple to their God and they can't even fix their own walls. What a shameful disgrace. So that's the modern scholarship psychological approach to it. But to get halakhic man about it, one of the quirkiest halachot that we have, that if you have any sense of history whatsoever, you realize it's so quirky. Here you go. You know that Purim, going to a much more familiar text than Ezra and Nehemiah for many of us, myself included, Purim has a law enshrined in the Megillah itself. Shushan had to fight that extra day, and as a result, they observed a festive day on the 15th day of Adar, whereas most of the empire already was observing a festive day on the 14th day of Adar because they only needed one day to fight their enemies. So far, so good. Megillat Esther continues to say, as a result of this, all Jews living in walled cities, out of solidarity with Shushan, observe on the 15th, what we call today Purim Shushan. Some people call it Shushan Purim. I don't know why, but anyway, but Purim Shushan or Shushan Purim, whatever makes you happier, you know what I'm talking about. And then most Jews celebrate Purim on the 14th day. Okay. So as you know, if you have any historical sense, there are many cities through history that there are some periods in which it was surrounded by a wall and some periods in which it's not surrounded by a wall. Every wall had to be built at some point. So if you had to codify, if we were the council of halachists codifying this law, at what moment in time would we choose to say, okay, you're considered a walled city. You should observe Purim Shushan on the 15th day. I'll put out my vote, and if you disagree with me, I would be stunned. We should keep the date that should be chosen, without a doubt, and without even having to think about it, is the time of the Purim story. When else? Obviously, the story happened then, and so, okay, all Jews living in walled cities at that moment, going forward, should observe on the 15th, even though over time, some of these walls may be breached or destroyed. That sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me. There is a dat yachid in the Talmud, one solitary opinion, that amazingly enough adopts that view. But the overwhelming majority, and of course how we rule, is no, We accept a walled city as a walled city from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun, Joshua, who lived many centuries before the Purim story. So that means, kind of funny, even if that city at the time of the Purim story no longer has a wall, too bad. We follow the Yehoshua walled city rule. Now, the question, of course, is why? That's how we paskin. That's the halacha. I'm not trying to overturn it, of course, but I'm curious why in the world halacha would pick such a seemingly arbitrary date. And the Bavli doesn't explain itself. It just, that's the ruling. And so we follow that. In the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Yerushalmi, there's a rationale for this ruling in Masachet Megillah. And it's an obvious rationale. If we would have accepted the obvious historical choice of having Purim Shushan dated, walled cities being dated to the time of the Purim story, we would be paskening la halacha, we would be ruling on halachic grounds that Jerusalem is not a real city. Because at the time of the Purim story, Jerusalem's walls are still breached. We will not do that. Halacha can never make such a ruling. Jerusalem is the ultimate real city. And so we have to pick a time far away from the Purim story when Jerusalem's walls were fine. And in fact, it wasn't even an Israelite city yet. Doesn't matter, but there's a wall. And that way we can at least say that Jerusalem is a real city. I mean, I'm speaking to at least some New Yorkers here. I know what a New Yorker thinks because I'm a New Yorker too. I happen to live in Teaneck. If you ask any New Yorker, what is a real city? That New Yorker properly would tell you just New York. There are no other real cities in the world, right? But in halacha, a real city is any city with a wall around it. And biblically speaking, also, that's what a real city would be. Jerusalem wasn't the only city in town, even if you lived there. So that's how halacha rules, and that's why it rules that way. So it helps us understand Nehemiah's feeling that this is a cherpa. It is so shameful that our capital sacred city, with a temple standing in it already for a while by the time of Nehemiah, doesn't matter. The walls of the city are down. We hang our heads in grief and shame. And that's what we're looking at here. So Nehemiah reacts. When I heard that, I sat and wept and was in mourning for days, fasting and praying to the God of heaven. He then recounts his prayer. Finally, 4 months later, in chapter 2, he works up the guts to talk to the king about it. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, finally we hear Artaxerxes' name, but we already knew that from the Ezra side of the book, as I mentioned before. Wine was set before him. I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had never been out of sorts in his presence. You better believe it. A king's official, a cupbearer, is not just the guy who brings the drinks. He is one of the most trusted servants of the king for A, the obvious reason that you need to know that this guy isn't going to poison you, but also B, you're constantly overhearing all these incredibly important secret meetings between you and your own nobles or you and other kings. All kinds of stuff is happening in the throne room. And the cupbearer must be an absolutely trustworthy and trusted servant. So Nehemiah is the sort of man who knows how to keep his cool. But today he looked like he was out of sorts. So the king picks this up right away. The king said to me, "How is it that you look bad, though you are not ill? It must be bad thoughts." I was very frightened. So the king is concerned. So there's an interesting machloket. There's an interesting debate among two of our most prominent medieval commentators, whether you want to inject a ton of drama into this or not. So if you go for the drama, Rashi is your man. Rashi thinks that Artaxerxes is actually worried that if Nehemiah looks out of sorts, it must be that he is plotting to assassinate the king. And he just can't hide it. So Rashi imagines a truckload of drama going inside of Artaxerxes' mind right now. Oh no, my cupbearer has lost his cool. It must be that something evil is about to happen. So it could just be that he's paranoid, although contemporary historians point out, Artaxerxes' predecessor, Achashverosh, in Megillat Esther, we see that there was an attempt on his life, right? Bigtan and Teresh wanted to assassinate him. What you don't find out in Megillat Esther is that that same king was assassinated a few years later by other people. So King Xerxes / Achashverosh himself had been assassinated. So Artaxerxes has reason to be somewhat concerned. He also recently just quelled a rebellion. Artaxerxes just quelled a rebellion in Egypt that same year. Again, you don't see that in Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah at all, but from contemporaneous writings from the Greeks and from the Persians, Artaxerxes has been on the run quite a bit, and his predecessor has been assassinated. So the Rashi reading has a lot of historical merit, whether or not it's the pshat here. Ralbag, on the flip side, by the way, Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, living in the 14th century, disagrees and says no. He just sees that Nehemiah is agitated, and Nehemiah is a trusted advisor. The king cares about his trusted advisors. Oh no, Nehemiah, what's wrong? He's not worried. He's just concerned for his beloved, or certainly very trusted, servant. So Ralbag doesn't think there's any drama here. I like debates like that. All right, so I wanted to share that, and now we can move on. So he tells the king, I answered the king, may the king live forever. How should I not look bad when the city of the graveyard of my ancestors lies in ruins, and its gates have been consumed by fire? So the king said to me, what is your request? With a prayer to the God of heaven, I answered the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Yehudah, to the city of my ancestors' graves, to rebuild it. So the king says, okay. All right. And he sets the gears in motion. He's fully supportive of this. And he even sends royal military escort. When I came to the governors of the province of beyond the river, that's what we call Israel in Ezra and Nehemiah, that's what the Persians called it. It was a tax district. I gave them the king's letters, giving him authority to rebuild the walls. The king also sent army officers and cavalry with me. So it's a very powerful entourage showing royal support. Everything is looking good. And Nehemiah is ready to build the walls. But of course, you may recall from 2 weeks ago, these enemies are still around. Well, after the Zerubbabel period, the enemies continued to plague us throughout the period. And so here we go. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard, it displeased them greatly that someone had come intent on improving the condition of the Israelites. So these are going to be the enemies on the set, along with some other guy, Geshem the Arab. Cool name. Rain, I like that. But in the meantime, that's his name. That's a third fellow who's going to enter the enemy camp. So these are the big honchos, and they're going to give an awful lot of trouble to Nehemiah and the men, including trying to have Nehemiah trapped and or assassinated. They physically threaten the Jewish builders of the wall to the point where the Jews have to use half of their men to build, and the other half of the men hold weapons simply to protect themselves against a potential attack. So all these things are coming down the pike, but these enemies are going to cause trouble. So in the meantime, Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem. I arrived in Jerusalem after I was there 3 days. I got up at night, I and a few men with me. Okay, it's a crack commando mission in the middle of the night. Nobody can see this. Telling no one what my God had put into my mind to do for Jerusalem, and taking no other beast than the one in which I was riding. Wow, it sounds like he's going to do something really secret here that he better not be detected doing this. I went out by the valley gate at night toward the Jackal's Spring and the Dung Gate, and I surveyed the walls of Jerusalem that were breached and its gates consumed by fire. Wow, he looked at the walls. How incredible. It's a good thing he did this at night and was not caught. It's a very strange mission that he is on. He could have done this at noon. He could have just taken a Tiyul, walked around and seen the breaches. It seems like an unbelievably low-key thing to do under such secrecy. But that's what the word means. The Hebrew is, this is just really cool coming up, by the way, sover. Sover is like the word svara in the Gemara, if you study Gemara. Sover just means I surveyed it, I considered it. Okay, so that's what he did. And that's what the text says, and that's the way that it goes. But you should know that in medieval manuscripts, remember, Hebrew biblical texts are written without vocalization. So all you have is the letter shin, the letter bet, and the letter resh, but you don't know how to vocalize it. Our tradition tells us to vocalize it sover. But in certain medieval manuscripts of Tanakh, including the one that Rashi had, by the way, the word is not sover, it's shover, with a shin, not a sin. Shover means he was taking sledgehammers and shattering the walls. Okay, that's already more of a crack commando sort of thing to do. The reason why he would be doing this is either to test the strength of the walls or to break them even more than they already are broken, to encourage the entire community that we really need to do something about it. But either way, that would be a much gutsier thing to do and might require the secrecy of night. I'm not poskening like Rashi here. The Masoretic text does have sover, and the experts in the Misarah support that view. It clearly was the Masoretic text was a sin, but there were certain medieval manuscripts that had a shin, which in this case makes a lot more sense to me. And again, Rashi and a few other Mifarshim had such a text. This is not a machloket. They're not debating what the text means. They simply actually had different readings of the text. Very minor, but actually has a huge impact on all of this. Okay. In the meantime, he's surveying the walls, sees them, gets everybody together and says, guys, we can't do this. It is absolutely shameful. We need to build it. And he says in 17, then I said to them, you see the bad state we are in, Jerusalem lying in ruins and its gates destroyed by fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and suffer no more disgrace. Here's the word cherpa again. It was very shameful to the people, as we already discussed. I told them of my God's benevolent care for me and also the things the king had said to me. And they said, let us start building. Okay, the people are on Nehemiah's side. They're ready to do it, especially since they know they have royal support, because without that, they'd be, why bother? The king already forcibly stopped the building earlier in his own reign. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab, there's Geshem, heard, they mocked us and held us in contempt and said, what is this you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? It's too easy of an accusation. I said to them in reply, the God of heaven will grant us success, and we, his servants, will start building. But you have no share or claim or stake in Jerusalem. Stay out of this. We're building. Nehemiah is very tough, thankfully, and he sticks to his guns the whole way through. And so the building process begins. We find a couple of very curious aspects of the building in chapter 3. Look who starts the building. Eliashiv, the high priest, and his fellow priests set to and rebuilt the sheep gate. How about that? They get out their hammers and nails, and they're part of the building process. I always pictured the priesthood. They're going to maintain the Beit HaMikdash and run the service. That's their job. And let all the rest of us build the walls. But they were at the front and center of the whole thing. They consecrated it and set up its doors, consecrating it as far as the Hundredth Tower, as far as the Tower of Hananel. We also see a very interesting feature. That the Kohanim are sanctifying the walls of Jerusalem. As we know, it's Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh. That term is used in later books in Tanakh. And so the Kohen Gadol and all of his underlings are physically building the walls and consecrating them as they go along. The whole rest of this chapter is a massive long list of the names of the other builders. It seems very massive. Look how the time it takes me just to scroll really quickly. My goodness. Finally, that's it. All the way down to here, all the way down to verse 32. It's a lot of names. Those names could be taken in two different directions. One is Rav Mordechai Zer Kavod. I've mentioned him before, but let's just get that again. Hold on. Came back to the meeting group chat. Here we go. Rav Mordechai Zer Kavod wrote the Dot Mikra commentary, and that's what I put on the chat just now. Just his name again. I've mentioned him before. He thinks that this long list is deceptive. If you actually pay attention to the names, which I just boomed on through, some of the names actually repeat. That there are some names of people who had to work on two different sections of the wall. He deduces from this that, in fact, very few people participated. He thinks that this list puts the people of Israel to shame. Very few people had the courage or gumption or wanted to put in the effort to build these walls. Many other scholars today disagree and say, no, the names on this list are not all the builders. It's simply the foremen, the people who led the building project in each section of the wall, but presumably many other hundreds, if not thousands of people joined in the efforts. So you can take your pick whether you see this as a criticism of, or whether you see this as a praise of Bnei Israel. Either way, they're building a lot, which is great. Okay, hold it. Okay. In the meantime, the enemies get back into action. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, it angered him. He was extremely vexed. Love that word. He mocked the Jews, saying in the presence of his brothers and the Sumerian force, what are the miserable Jews doing? Will they restore, offer sacrifice, and finish one day? Can they revive those stones out of the dust heaps, burned as they are? These bad guys are bad, but they're not very witty. They tried to be. Tobiah the Ammonite alongside him said, that stone wall they are building, if a fox climbed in, he would breach it. Ha, ha, ha. You can see them all chortling over on the sidelines. Meantime, the Jews ignored them and continued to build. Here, our God, we have become a mockery. and return their taunts upon their heads. Let them be taken as a spoil to a land of captivity. Nehemiah didn't tolerate that too much and prays that they should be destroyed. Do not cover up their iniquity or let their sin be blotted out before you, for they hurled provocations at the builders. We rebuilt the wall until it was continuous all around to half its height, for the people's heart was in the work. That's great. So they continue to build higher and higher. They finally have it. The breaches are filled in and they still have to make it higher. So then in chapter 4, it's all about how they start, the enemies start threatening physical force. And the result of this is what I said before, half the Jews continue to build and the other half stand there with their weapons. It's really the precursor to Yeshivat Hesder, right? Some version of everybody is being righteous. They're all building Jerusalem, but you need a military in order to protect the sacred work of building the walls. So all of chapter 4 revolves around that threat. Chapter 5 is something that kind of floats. When I say floats, most of Nehemiah 1 through 7, which is what we're doing tonight, revolves around the building of the wall. That's really the point. And so there's some drama associated with it, and I'm picking some of the highlights to look at with you. Chapter 5 is a floater in the sense that it's not necessarily sequential. This chapter could have happened at any time during Nehemiah's tenure, because it's a whole different story. It's not about the walls at all. This is a story about widespread poverty, which could have happened right at this moment, but it could have happened 5 years earlier. Well, not 5 years earlier. Nehemiah just arrived, or 5 years later, anytime. There was a great outcry and chapter 6 will resume the story of the building of the wall. There was a great outcry by the common folk and their wives against their brother Jews. Some said, our sons and daughters are numerous. We must get grain in order to eat in order that we may live. Okay, so one level of poverty is we don't have enough to feed our families. Okay. Others said we must pawn our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain to stave off hunger. They're more desperate than the first group. Right? They're having to sell or pawn, whatever they're doing, their properties, even their land, in order to obtain money to feed their families. Others said, we have borrowed money against our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. Now we start seeing why they're all so poor. The king's taxes were crippling. In fact, they were really, 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 really bad. There's a wonderful scholar who wrote a book back in 1990. Hold on a second. Here I come again. His name is Edwin Yamauchi. It's called Persia and the Bible. It's a great book from 1990. Here it comes for the chat. So he happens to have command of whatever they knew back in 1990 of the Persian Empire. I mean, scholarship is always evolving, but it's new enough that most of his material that I care about is still relevant. He points out that in Cyrus's time, we actually have records of all this stuff. It's so cool. The interest rates were 20%. Okay, that's pretty high. Some credit card bills are even higher, right? Always pay on time. But in the meantime, 20% is a very hefty sum. By Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes, the king who we're in right now, it rose to 40 to 50%, more than double. So at some point, unless you are wildly wealthy, this is literally deadly. I mean, it's an awful, crippling type of tax that even if you're working your tail off to provide for your family, you lose so much of it to taxation is simply a disaster. So we have actual numbers from the Persian Empire simply to support the people's complaint over here. If you look at source number 3, we saw this last time, but let's look at it again in Nehemiah chapter 9, which we'll actually look at next week. And now our God, great, mighty, and awesome God, who stays faithful to his covenant, do not treat lightly all the suffering that has overtaken us, our kings, our officers, our priests, our prophets, our fathers, and all your people, from the time of the Assyrian kings to this day. Today we are slaves in the land that you gave our fathers to enjoy its fruit and bounty. They really are. This is an absolutely true statement. It's not rhetoric. The Jews really felt like they were slaves in their own land. And we see references to this time and again in our Sefer, including what we're looking at right now. On account of our sins, it yields its abundant crops to kings whom you have set over us. The kings are just taking all of our crops. We're working hard. The bountiful land is being bountiful, but then the Persians take it all. or take so much that they're devastated to the point where they cannot feed their families, they have to pawn their fields, or some of them are even going to have to sell their own children into slavery, which we didn't get to yet. But if you look back at verse 5 on the screen, now we are as good as our brothers, and our children as good as theirs, yet here we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. That is a last step of desperation here. You do everything that they did already. If that doesn't work, you sell your children into slavery in that world, because at least they will live. They won't starve to death in your own home. They'll be fed. They'll have to work very hard. It's not good to be a slave at all. But it's better than the alternative, which is abject starvation, which is what they're going through right now. Some of our daughters are already subjected, and we are powerless, while our fields and vineyards belong to others. We have nothing more to sell other than our own children. There's a fabulous drasha on Megillat Esther that really captures the spirit. I mean, this is dreadful what we're reading right now. At the very end of Megillat Esther, you have source number 4. King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the mainland and the islands. Okay, so he taxed them. Now we know he raised taxes quite a bit, didn't he? But then the Gemara says they darshan his name Ahasuerus, which is it's a Persian name. It's really pronounced something along the lines of Shayarsha. That's how he would have said it himself, or at least closer version of that. So Megillat Esther calls him Ahasuerus. That's what we Jews call him. It's like a Hebrew transliteration. But be that as it may, in the Gemara, they make a drasha on his name. Source 5. Rabbi Hanina said, the name alludes to the fact that everyone became poor. The Hebrew for that is Rash in his days, as it is stated, and the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land. That's actually sort of true. Right? Not everyone, but there were wealthy nobles in Judea here. But most of the Jews were facing absolutely crippling poverty, to the point where they're pawning their fields, and even some of them are selling their own children into slavery. Nehemiah obviously is fuming about this. He cannot believe it's that bad. It angered me very much to hear their outcry and these complaints. After pondering the matter carefully, I censured the nobles and the prefect, saying, are you pressing claims on loans made to your brothers? Then I raised a large crowd against them. Nehemiah turns to the nobles and said, look, you guys have been lending all these poor people money, right? Don't collect the debt. Forgive every person's debt. We have to make this work. We can't allow our fellow Jews, in fact, most of them, to pawn their fields or sell their children into slavery. And said to them, we have done our best to buy back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Will you now sell your brothers so that they must be sold back to us? They kept silent, for they found nothing to answer. So Nehemiah throws it in their faces, like, we obviously have chipped in, not in our Sefer, but I'm sure he's telling the truth, that they had redeemed other Jews who had been sold into slavery and brought them back. Good for them. They all got their names in the papers. They all looked great. But now, because they're demanding all of their debts back from these poor Jews are reselling their own children into slavery. Nehemiah says, we can't do that. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. You ought to act in a God-fearing way so as not to give our enemies, the nations, room to reproach us. Is what you and I call in Talmudic language a chilul Hashem. Right? I mean, chilul Hashem is a biblical term, but it's specifically used in this way in Masachet Yoma and elsewhere. That's typically how we continue to use the term. But Nehemiah is saying it the same way. That not only is this evil, but of course, we look really bad doing this, don't we? And then Nehemiah says that he's forgiving his claims, and they should forgive their claims as well. Nehemiah then throws in, because it's kind of a personal account, he's able to throw in what a good job he does. Furthermore, from the day I was commissioned to be governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes until his 32nd year, 12 years in all, neither I nor my brothers ever ate of the governor's food allowance, even though they were allowed to. I don't want to burden the community. It would have come out of our pockets, right? It would have been income tax that feeds the governor. So he says, I don't want your money. I'm rich. I can take care of myself. The regular Jews should not have to support me. The former governors who preceded me, throws in a little insult to his predecessors, whoever they were, laid heavy burdens on the people and took for them bread and wine, more than 40 shekels of silver. Their servants also tyrannized over the people, but I, out of the fear of God, did not do so. So he contrasts himself and his benign, really generous leadership with that of his predecessors, who were only too happy to collect, to live in luxury on the backs of the people of Judea. At the very end of the chapter, he then throws in a personal thing that he says a few more times in chapter 13. Excuse me. Oh my God, remember to my credit all that I've done for this people. He actually pats himself on the back here and a few more times in chapter 13. It's very unusual biblically to have anybody patting himself on his back like this. But then again, most biblical narratives are not presented as first person narratives, ostensibly written by Nehemiah, in this case, himself. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like this is some chronicle that he wrote, which was then divinely, through divine inspiration, the prophet compiling this book included it as is. Well, Chazal, in one passage, really don't like Nehemiah's tone here. They like what he does. He's a very righteous man. Builds the walls of the cities, stands strong against our enemies, piously forgives all of his loans and the loans of others. But they don't appreciate A, he puts down his predecessors too much, and B, he gives himself a little too much credit over here. So there's a fascinating passage in source number 6, the last source in our source sheets for today, in Masechet Sanhedrin. They're bothered. This goes back to what Bernie and I were talking about at 8:30. Well, not 31, because we started at 8:32. At 8:33, I'm very Yekish like that too. But in the meantime, even though there's not a drop of Yekish blood in me, but it's okay. I like timeliness a lot. So in the meantime, at 8:33, we were having a conversation about how there is no such thing as Sefer Nehemiah. It's one book that Chazal called Sefer Ezra. And it's what we now think of as Ezra and then Nehemiah. And that's how that's what we're learning. So the Gemara in this passage is bothered. Why is Sefer Ezra only called Sefer Ezra? Shouldn't it also be called Sefer Nehemiah? Because after all, Nehemiah wrote a lot of it. Right? So you need to understand the traditional background to the book name to appreciate the question. So they get involved here in source number 6. The whole subject matter of the book of Ezra, that's what it's called in the Gemara, right, was narrated by Nehemiah, son of Chachaliah. Why then was the book not called by his name? Why isn't it called Sefer Nehemiah, or at least Ezra and Nehemiah? Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said, because he claimed merit for himself, as it is written, think upon me, my God, for good. Rabbi Yirmiyah doesn't like that line that's currently bold-faced, right? The fact that he gives himself credit, he deserves credit. He did a lot of amazing things, but still a little too self-driven for Rav Yirmiyah's liking. And as a result, he says that's why it's not called Sefer Nehemiah. Fascinating. The other view, Rabbi Yosef said, because he spoke disparagingly of his predecessors. That's the verse that we saw above in verse 15. This one. But the former governors that had been before me were chargeable unto the people and had taken of them bread and wine beside 40 shekels of silver, etc. Okay, fine. So there are two reasons given, both what we just read, that even though this is a chapter where Nehemiah really demonstrates superb leadership on a personal level and by leading the nobles to help the entire community. He really does a great job. I really like him as a character. All the same, this Gemara feels some degree of discomfort with his putting down others. Just do good things. Don't worry about the others. And don't pat yourself on the back too much. These are two lessons that this Gemara teases out of our chapter. And in fact, they hold him accountable for it to the point where they say this is why the book is not named after him. Okay, be that as it may, now we go back to the story of the wall, which is what I thought we were doing this whole time until chapter 5 showed up. And that was just, again, a floating chapter about the state of poverty at that time in Israel. We get back to our enemies who at this point are trying to plot assassinations of Nehemiah. As usual, Nehemiah is too smart, sees right through their evil little tricks, does not fall into their traps. And once again, here he prays against the enemies again. Oh my God, remember against Toviah and Sanballat these deeds of theirs, against Noadiah the prophetess, and against all the other prophets that wish to intimidate me. I'm sure she was not a real prophetess, but she certainly acted as one. And they were all trying to get him killed. So thankfully, he saw through their plans and again did not do that, but he prays that God should punish them. The wall was finished on the 25th of Elul after 52 days. That is fast. Wow, the whole building project took just 52 days? That's astonishing. After 141 years of lying in ruins, I understand politically they couldn't build it. It wasn't just the speed thing. It could be perceived as a rebellion. So Rashi and Ralbag understand. That's exactly what it means. That it took 52 total days from when Nehemiah began the building project until they completed it then. Many contemporary scholars assume that that is absolutely right, on the grounds that, don't forget, most of the walls were there already, and they just had to repair certain breaches. right? It's not that they were building a brand new huge wall from scratch. They were simply repairing a breached wall from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Certain scholars also point out that there are other records from the ancient world of speedy wall building. Athens was restored in 1 month. Walls of Constantinople were repaired after 60 days. So we have comparable amounts of time, meaning not many, many years, in other accounts also from that general period. Josephus, actually, in his writings, I don't know how he got this number, when he's telling over our story, he says that it took the Jews 2 years and 4 months to repair the walls, even though our text says 52 days. That's a pretty big gap. Contemporary scholars tend to agree that Josephus doesn't seem to have any independent source of corroboration, and he just sort of made it up. Or maybe he was quoting somebody else who made it up, and therefore it is not treated as credible. The standard view is that it took 52 days to repair breaches within the wall, but it wasn't a brand new wall that happened at that time. Even though these enemies have been giving Nehemiah a lot of grief, it's very clear that there's another side to this story. When our enemies heard it, all the nations around us were intimidated and fell very low in their own estimation. They realized that this work had been accomplished by the help of our God. Also in those days, the nobles of Judah kept up a brisk correspondence with Tobiah and Tobiah with them. Just when you thought these enemies are these evil enemies, you have to remember there are always some Jews who support the enemies. And in this case, there were also. Not only did they support him, but prominent Jewish nobles had their children married to these enemies. And so they worked together, and this was all against the Jewish community, of course. Also in those days, the nobles of Judah kept, I already read that, sorry. Many in Judah were his confederates, for he was a son-in-law of Shechaniah, son of Arah, and his son Yochanan had married the daughter of Meshulam, son of Berechiah. So these prominent Jewish families are busy marrying and playing, full scale with one of the great enemies of this time, who was plotting to assassinate Nehemiah, who had sent armed men to try to kill Jewish builders of the wall. But all the same, some of the nobility, they're busy married to him and his family. And as a result, it obviously created quite a conflict. They would also speak well of him to me. So they were basically like traitors to our people, these Jews, who tried very hard to stick up for this enemy activity and to justify it, and would divulge my affairs to him. They actually tried to turn Nehemiah in. Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me, but I'm sure you've picked up the vibe. Nehemiah is not very easily intimidated. Meanwhile, Nehemiah now realizes, okay, the walls are done, but there's just one problem left, and that's going to carry us into next week also, but we still have chapter 7 to do right now very briefly. Jerusalem is our capital city. The temple is in it. The priesthood is functional. There's an operational temple running its daily service. Everything is looking good. Problem here is that nearly no Jews live in Jerusalem. The city is a wasteland. It's empty. Most of the Jews who are there live in the countryside. They don't live in the capital city of Jerusalem. So Nehemiah realizes this, and in chapter 11, he's going to have to deal with this head on. We'll talk about it next week, but I'll sneak preview it. He actually demanded, all of you Jews in Israel living outside of Jerusalem, 10% of you must move in order to simply make the city viable. So you have two choices. If you volunteer, God bless you, then you're part of the 10%. However many volunteers go, great. But if that's not 10%, we're going to have a lottery with every single one of you guys. And anybody who gets drawn from the hat or whatever they use, you're going to move. I'm going to move you to Jerusalem. We're going to have 10% of you move. And that's what he did in chapter 11. He actually got over enough people to make Jerusalem a viable city. So that's what chapter 7 begins. When the wall was rebuilt and I had set up the doors, the tasks were assigned to the gatekeepers, singers, and Levites. I put Hanani, my brother, and Hananiah, captain of the fortress, in charge of Jerusalem, for he was a more trustworthy and God-fearing man than most. I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the heat of the day. And before you leave your posts, let the doors be closed and barred. It was still very terrifying with all of these enemies. Assign the inhabitants of Jerusalem to watches, each man to his watch, and each in front of his own house. The city was broad and large. The people in it were few, and houses were not yet built. It's total desolation. My God put it into my mind to assemble the nobles, the prefects, and the people in order to register them by families. I found the genealogical register of those who were first to come up, and there I found written. What he now does from verse 6, here we go. Wow, a long chapter. How about that? This is almost verbatim what we saw in Ezra chapter 2 back in week 1. It is a repetition of every town and every family and the number of people who moved back in the time of Zerubbabel and Yehoshua, back in our week 1, which is 2 weeks ago. It's just almost verbatim. There are minor variations, there's some number variations, but it's basically the same list. And that's it. So the question is, why in the world, in such a short book, Ezra and Nehemiah, which remember is one book, do you need to repeat this massive list? Just say, I found the original list. Oh, there were 42,360. So I decided to get 10% of them to move. Rav Mordechai Zerkavod, who I mentioned in the chat a little while ago this evening, quotes Rashi and other commentators who all point out that there are times in Tanakh that things are repeated for what's called chiba. They are so beloved to Hashem, to the prophets, that it's worth repeating this list. On one level, one thing that you see time and again, and we've seen enough just even like scroll through typically very quickly, there are many, many, many name lists in our book. Clearly, these were beloved to the Navi or Nevi'im writing Ezra and Nehemiah. And so the idea of repeating this massive name list, bless these people who made Aliyah and helped rebuild the land of Israel at the beginning of the Second Temple period. So that's definitely part of the answer. There's one other component, and I have to get my chat back on. Hello. I've mentioned her before also in the past, Tamara Cohn Ashkenazi. She's an academic scholar who published a book called In the Age of Prose back in 1988 that I think has some really good insights. Here's one of those insights. There's a modern term that literary scholars like to use. It's called an inclusio, which is a really irritating word because typically when I write it, my auto, spell checker immediately changes it to inclusion because it just doesn't know what inclusio is. But inclusio is a real word. In regular English, it just means bookends. A biblical passage doesn't have to be biblical, but Tanakh does this all the time, where a passage begins and ends with the same word, phrase, verse, etc. And in this case, she argues that this is a grand inclusio, that from Ezra chapter 2 down to Nehemiah chapter 7, which remember it's all one book, is trying to create a major unit. And her argument is a very important one, that in Ezra and Nehemiah, we learn something very interesting. The temple obviously is the heart of Jerusalem, which is the heart of our country, etc. But in Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, the temple and the walls are both utterly sacred and utterly necessary. That even if the temple is standing, which it has been for a while, almost not a century, but over 70 years by now, by the real time of our story, that's not enough. As long as the walls of Jerusalem remained breached, the temple itself isn't fully built, because the city of Jerusalem and its sanctity is required to make it all complete. And so she argues that this inclusio, by redoing this whole name list a second time, it's an excellent way of bridging the reigns of Cyrus and Darius, who were the Persian emperors who allowed the temple to be rebuilt, and now Artaxerxes, Artaxasta, who allows the city walls to be repaired. Once all of that is done, we can move into the climactic frame of our book, which is what we're going to do next week, where we have here, when the 7th month arrived, the Israelites being settled in their towns, the entire people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the teaching, aka the Torah of Moshe, with which the Lord had charged Israel. The people, at their own initiative, gather in Jerusalem and ask Ezra to teach them Torah. It's amazing, and they have a huge religious revival. That's what we're going to do next week. But Ashkenazi argues that you can do this only once you have the sanctity of Jerusalem complete. Temple is now built and operational. The walls of the city are built and operational. Now it's time to generate ourselves on a spiritual level, and that's what we're going to do next time. This is my moment where I pause and say, okay, folks, I would love to hear questions, comments, reactions, feedback to all the things that we've been doing, just like we've done the first couple of weeks. I found that very productive way to end the shiur.
I'm not sure if there's an answer to this question, but in periods of history, they expanded the domain of the Azara, of the Mikdash. Do we know if that happened during this period of time?
There's nothing in the Sefer about any Azara or temple improvements during the biblical period after the original rebuilding was done, what we saw a couple of weeks ago. I don't know when these things were done. You would have to ask the archaeologists to give their best guess of what the dating would be of that expansion. A lot of the expansion certainly happened post Tanakh, right? And Herod is the best example, but you're right. There were things before that. I don't know how far back those before that things go.
Interesting. Yeah. It's interesting to try to piece the different periods of which you've been helping us on the different periods of history together, because we
Of
sort of have snippets, but to see the chronology is fascinating.
Yeah, me too. I think it's great. And again, I credit modern scholarship for doing a lot. I'll quote, because you mentioned this, it's not in our Sefer, but it's in Sefer Zechariah. Sefer Zechariah, which we met Zechariah 2 weeks ago. He prophesied in 520, 518 BCE, exactly helping to encourage the completion of the Beit HaMikdash, along with his colleague, the Navi Haggai. They were the two Nevi'im operational who are mentioned in our book. But in our Sefer, it's all about they encourage the building and the people listen, the end. But we also have Sefer Haggai and Sefer Zechariah, where we get a lot more nuance to their message. Zechariah's book in particular is oftentimes incredibly cryptic, not just for somebody like you or me, but for people like Rashi, who opens up his commentary by saying, boy, this book is really hard. That is so disheartening for people like me. I'm counting on Rashi to help me for any sefer, but if Rashi says it's hard, you're in trouble. Well, what will Ibn Ezra do? He says, the sefer is really hard. In fact, oftentimes incomprehensible. But then Ibn Ezra adds one cool feature that speaks very strongly to what Bernie was just talking about. He said, I have no idea what a lot of these visions are, but he says, were we to find some ancient histories to understand the context of the period better, then we would be like a blind person walking against a wall, with some support to say maybe this or that refers to that event. But now we have no wall. All I can tell him is that was so prescient of him, because now we have tons and tons of material, and we're like a blind man with a wall. We're able to make certain educated guesses that Ibn Ezra couldn't even make about the nature of Sefer Zechariah, but it remains oftentimes very cryptic and difficult to sort out. So I think your point is well taken just on the historian side. Obviously, they're doing the best they can, often with very scant evidence. Okay, hold on. Okay, yes. Other questions, comments, you could put it in the chat, or you could just signal to me that or start talking. Just make sure to unmute.
So,
Oh, yeah. Okay. Shana.
okay. So perhaps you're going to cover this towards the end of your sessions, but I'm just wondering. So now the temple is considered complete. The walls are built and it's complete. 2 weeks ago, rather, you noted that, there was still things that were missing, the ark cover, the fire, there was no Shekhinah, the prophecy, Urim V'Tumim, there was no Kohen Gadol. So basically what was left, it was just korbanot. What was left there?
You certainly had, first of all, there was a Kohen Gadol, so delete that one from that list.
Okay.
But all the other things, you're right. There's no question they had a Kohen Gadol from day one. Yehoshua was the original founding Kohen Gadol who helped lead the community in that week one. By now we had somebody named Eliashiv who led the charge in building the walls. We had Kohanim Gadolim. They brought korbanot and incense. They ran the avodah. They ran the service of the temple as it had been done in the past. You are certainly right, though, that the fundamental nature of the temple has been changed forever by not having the ark or God's presence or prophecy or a fire from heaven on the altar. Such basic heart and soul features of the temple are now missing, which creates that mixed impression that we talked about 2 weeks ago. And I'm sure I'll sum up with some of these things next week also, as you suggest. Just that on the one hand, this is a tremendous redemption that we're witnessing here in our Sefer. On the other hand, so many important things are missing. It's hard to know what kind of redemption is this. It's certainly not what the prophets before the temple's destruction, before the first temple's destruction, envisioned. It's just a pale reflection of that. So your point is extremely well taken.
So the second part of it actually is, and this is not to be answered tonight, but something to think about. So all the discussions going on in Israel, about building yet a third Beis HaMikdash, you know, what what is envisioned for that? We're not
Uh,
do sacrifices now, or are we gonna
I plead lack of prophecy for that one. I'll take any Mashiach that Hashem wants to offer us, and I believe that we have an important role to play in helping to bring it by improving our society. God willing, that should all happen, and then I'm going to let the powers that be work out details about specifics. I'm happy to indulge in all of those specifics, whatever they might be. Stephen.
I was also very taken with your theological arguments at the end of the last class. And I wonder how that fits in with the patterns that we see here. It seems that we begin with God being identified as Shomer HaBrit. Then we see that we have violations of that. In Ezra, it was intermarriage, a breach with the family. And here it's a breach of the walls in Nehemiah. There's a sense of mourning. They undergo a sense of mourning, and then they take action. And then they end with a genealogical list. These are two very clear parallels. So the question is, to go back to your theological argument, when do we have a sense, or when do you think they have a sense, that this partial redemption is in fact fixed as a partial redemption? In other words, are all of these actions an attempt to make a non-partial redemption, and the hope that they can be concluded at this point? And the reason that I say all of this is I'm very, very struck with you focused on the Kohanim consecrating, but there's also this passage where Leviim sing. You set up your walls, you set up your gates, you set up your guards, your watchmen, and then they bring in the Leviim to sing. And I'm wondering if there's a sense that you're trying to push the redemption at this point from partial to complete.
You raise an excellent point. A lot of what you're raising right now is an excellent segue actually into next week. This week, you didn't feel the sense of, it's the only one of my 4 weeks where it's not about the ambiguity of redemption. Nehemiah had a project. There were enemies who tried to thwart him. He stuck it out and the Jews were brave, right? So it looks like things are coming together. Next week, we're going to see a remarkably complex thing where, again, you see, wow, the Jews want to all hear Torah and repent, and they're going to agree to keep the whole Torah. It feels like Mashiach is really coming now, or at least the Jewish side of it is like, wow, we're really getting our act together. And yet, and we're going to see next week, the and yet is going to seriously impede on our perception again. So I think your point is very well taken, and I think we really need next week to flesh that point out. But you're right, the Leviim singing, which we had an allusion to a moment ago, they're going to play a major role in this in next week's shiur, where they help lead the entire community in Torah study and prayer.
Okay.
That's an amazing conclusion. I'm not sure I'm yet prepared for Mashiachiyut, but redemption we're certainly all in need of. So we look forward immensely to that next week. Thank you so
wonderful.
much.
Thank you all again. Have a great night. If you haven't yet done so, count the Omer, and I look forward to picking up with you and finishing our series next Wednesday, God willing. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. Look forward immensely.
Thank you.
Good night.